Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here to share with you some information about SQL Server and the new hybrid environments. I'm really honored to be here with you. For the people who doesn't know me, my name is Pablo Javier, as Sean was introducing me before. I work as a cloud solution architect. My life was a lot with SQL Server. I work with SQL Server since version 7. I've migrated SQL Server 6.5. So a lot of history for me with SQL Server. Now I'm moving to work with data in cloud, of course. I am a former MVP for data platform. And if you want to chat later, further, we can talk with LinkedIn or with Twitter as well. So just let me give you some overview of what I'm going to talk about in this session. I want to highlight some scenarios about working with SQL Server. What are new features, especially with these hybrid environments. But besides the features, of course, we need to understand that we have different alternatives now, and we had before some interesting alternatives to work also with hybrid environments. Most of the cases when we are about to start a project for migrating SQL Server to Azure or expanding our SQL Server, of course, we begin the conversations with high availability and disaster recovery scenarios. And then, of course, we have also the alternative to work with data modernization, not only with migration, not only moving to Azure SQL, but looking for analytics scenarios where we can expand our data and work with not only SQL Server data, right? We can work with different sources, we can work with different files, we can uh, expand and explore what's inside some images, videos, audios, etc. Right? So data modernization, uh, we can talk about a complete data warehouse infrastructure as well, right? So Aaron has had a question. So hybrid equals cloud plus on-premises. Yes, we want to talk about both. Okay, I want to show you here a little bit of history for SQL Server. You have seen that, of course, our earliest SQL Server versions 2008, 2008 R2. Of course, they are um, out of business right now, 2012, almost there. And our options that we see a lot in our customers are 2016, 17, and 19. Of course, we have the possibility to work with Azure SQL, with virtual machines, with platform as a service. And a little bit ago, we have the option to work with what was called SQL Data Warehouse, right? This evolution of services and this evolution, of course, of versions of SQL Server introduced us recently the SQL Server 2022. And a couple of years ago, we uh, started to work with Synapse Analytics as a complete workspace. It's not just a SQL data warehouse. It was before, the idea before was like we have a big SQL database with nodes, with distributed nodes. But now with Synapse Analytics, we want to share the holistic vision, the complete vision about moving the data, doing the ETLs, um, being really close to governance, working with Purview for data governance, and of course, we can integrate almost everything now inside Synapse. So this is also a very interesting topic we need to be aware, because Synapse is going to move this direction for the data warehouse and the modernization of analytics. Okay, so at Build a couple of weeks ago, when Microsoft announced SQL Server 2022, this slide was presented. You can see here, of course, we still have some improvements about the engine, the built-in query intelligence, more security, more scalability, availability, etc. But we have something very interesting here because SQL Server is moving through um, through the concept of working with Azure a little bit closer. That's why this concept is called cloud connected, because we hope that SQL Server is going to have the capabilities to work not only on premises, but being really close to Azure. Because I don't know what's your experience with SQL or on Azure, but most of the cases I've seen are related to migration, right? Moving what's on-prem to Azure, but not a lot of scenarios working in both parts, right? So that's a good point for SQL Server because um, it's trying to show that it's going to be easier to work with both environments. So I want to show you here another slide where we can see that when we begin the conversations about Azure SQL, of course, the main topics are related with performance, high availability, disaster recovery, migration, integration. But especially I want to talk here about these two, right? This integration and high availability and disaster recovery. Of course, when we are discussing about high availability and disaster recovery, we need to understand very good the concepts about RTO and RPO, right? Recovery time objective, recovery point objective. What are my goals in order to be able to continue my operations if something bad happens to my primary environment, right? So that's the most important thing when we want to design a scenario for high availability or disaster recovery. And when we talk about integration, of course, here I want to highlight, for example, the construction of the data warehouse. How do we move our data inside SQL Server in order to be explored by Synapse, by Databricks, by anything else, in order to give more analytics options to my organizations, right? And when we talk about Azure SQL, of course, I know you have seen this slide a lot because this is like the most iconic slide for knowing the difference for SQL Server on Azure, what are the options. And I want to highlight something here. You can see at the beginning the infrastructure as a service, the IaaS, the virtual machine. That's the most common scenario to have the same administration, the same working as in a SQL Server on premises. But in platform as a service, we have two options, SQL Managed Instance, SQL Database. And one of the most important benefits about platform as a service was the administration, right? Uh, was the alternative to delegate some administrative tasks to Azure in order to be more effective. I'm talking, for example, about backups, working with updates, right? Working with monitoring, etc. But even with infrastructure as service, we have now another alternatives. I want to show you some of them in order to still work with both environments with the same way of working with SQL Server as a virtual machine, but uh, taking advantage of the benefits of the new features that came from platform as a service. So when we are talking about business continuity, uh, we have seen a lot of these scenarios. We have seen what's the working, what's mirroring like, what's log shipping, replication, always on. Those are like our main alternatives. You are going to see that mirroring is a deprecated feature and we don't suggest to work with mirroring for new deployments, but instead we can work with AlwaysOn. AlwaysOn came to SQL Server on version 2012, and it was like the most important thing for SQL Server for business continuity scenarios, right? So, of course, we need to see here that this scenario for AlwaysOn, having different nodes, having different replicas, those are going to be also our main scenario in order to expand this and take advantage of what's going on Azure. Hybrid is now because, of course, new alternatives here. If we just focus on SQL Server, for example, or in Azure SQL, let's see these alternatives. The first one, we are talking about mirroring. We can work with mirroring on Azure, for example, different regions. We can work also with replication from database, from an Azure SQL database to an Azure storage, for example. We can work with backups, different regions as well, and we can work with always on. Everything here, you can see this is going to work within Azure, right? Those scenarios are, all of them are on Azure. Here, I want to show you that the same scenarios for business continuity can be deployed in an hybrid in an hybrid scenario. Take a look at here, for example, for mirroring, we can work with our principal database on premises. We can work with log shipping as well with our primary database on premises. Backups, I think in version 2014, maybe we have the possibility, since that version, we have the possibility to work with backups on Azure. Um, of course, our primary database on premises. And those scenarios are really common right now because, for example, log shipping is also a mechanism to work for migrations, right? So in some scenarios that we are not allowed to, for example, deploy a lot of servers or deploy bigger scenarios, a good starting point could be log shipping as well in order to have a replica from on-premises to Azure. So that's a good alternative as well. I want you to see that the same scenarios that we have deployed on premises, now we have the possibility to work also with the same scenarios, but moving the data to Azure. And one of the most interesting here is the AlwaysOn. The AlwaysOn can be expanded as well. So we have in the down part of this slide, we have the on-premises network, we have the domain controller, we have the replicas, and we have the possibility to work with a third or fourth or fifth replica on Azure. So this is interesting because a lot of scenarios, a lot of customers want to still remain all the infrastructure on premises, but in case of an emergency, they need another alternative that maybe it's not going to be another data center, but another data center from the same organization, but they want some other provider to have this scenario, right? So Azure is a very good alternative here. So we can have another replica on Azure. We can work with asynchronous replication as well here. And I think this is great because also we can take advantage about licensing. I don't know if you have seen before, but for SQL Server scenarios that have software assurance, for example, we can have a disaster recovery replica on Azure without paying that license, right? So that's great because we can take advantage of these licensing scenarios as well. So different alternatives for moving the data from on-premise to Azure. In this case, I'm not talking about specifically about migration, but I'm talking about high availability or disaster recovery. But also I want to show you which alternatives do we have to move the data, not thinking about business continuity, but just moving the data. So let me go through my portal. Let me go through there and share a little thing. For example, let's go to a SQL database. I'm going to look for my SQL databases here. I have here one called W. Let me show you here, for example. This is great. I don't know if you worked with SQL database, but for example, if you want to do some replicas to another region, it's really easy because you just need to go here to replicas. You just go to create replica and you give a new server in a different region. For example, here I have my primary that is on East US. I'm going to deploy a new server on a different region, and the replication is there. I don't need to configure anything else. I don't need to worry about networking configurations, anything. I just select a region. I just choose a name for my server, and that's all. And I have a replica for my SQL database. So that's great. But I want to show you here this alternative. For example, in the same data management, I have the alternative to sync to other databases. So if I choose sync to other databases, here I have the possibility to build some groups in order to do this replication from different sources. So let's do another quick example. For example, I'm going to have a group one, and here I want to sync this database. So I'm going to choose this database, AW. Do you want an automatic sync in case I want to this continually doing the replication? So I can enable this. Here I have a conflict resolution alternative. I'm going to share with you the details about this, but I want to show you especially how this works, okay? Here you have the possibility to work with private links. You always have the possibility to work with VNets, of course. I want to show you here just the process. I work with this group. Of course, it's going to take a couple of seconds in order to create this group. But what I want to do here, I want this Azure SQL database to be working synchronization with another database. So I have showed you before scenarios about replicating, for example, from different regions. But here, I think my group is already here. I want to show you here that I have here my databases, and I can add a new SQL database, or I can add an on-premises database. So that's great because if I go here and I'm going to add an on-premises database, take a look at here. It says you need to choose a sync agent gateway. So I can connect from here, from my SQL database to an on-premises scenario, but I need this sync agent gateway. So you can see here that I can create a new agent. I can use an existing agent. In this case, for example, I'm going to create a new agent. You can see here that my first step is download an agent. I'm going to choose an agent name, and then the most important thing, of course, when you are connecting on premises with Azure is create and generate a key in order to secure this environment, right? So I'm going to show you here my virtual machine, for example, where I have already installed this agent. This data sync agent the only thing you need to do here is submit these keys that we have generated before, and then we can register some database or some databases in order to move the data from on-premises to Azure. So in this case, for example, if I go back to my portal, you're going to see here that I can pick a name here, agent on-prem, for example. And if I generate a key, I'm going to have the values that I need to install in my on-premises virtual machine. And then I can start building the synchronization of my data that is on premises. So here is my agent key. I can copy it. I can paste it on my virtual machine. And I'm going to have the option, for example, I want to show you here this. I'm going to move to another database because I want to show you the result of this. I'm going again to sync other databases. Here is my group. And here you can see that I have different databases and I have different tables. So when I create, for example, this relationship with my SQL database from Azure and my SQL server on premises, now I have the possibility to work with different tables in order to synchronize them, or I can work with already created tables in order to move that data to SQL database, right? I want to show you here, let me go through this again because I want to highlight here that when I select this on-premises database, here you have the possibility also to work with sync directions. So the meaning here is that you have the possibility to only send the data that you have from on-premises to Azure, or you can work with bidirectional synchronization. So that's an interesting scenario because, of course, whatever you change on premises, it's going to be replicated on Azure and in the other way as well. So we have this option for bidirectional synchronization. And what are the main concerns here? I want to highlight again that this is not a high availability scenario. This is an alternative where we can move the data from on-premise to Azure or vice versa. But take a look at here. I'm going to zoom here. When I deploy this kind of synchronization, you are going to see new tables. Of course, we have new tables to track these changes that we are doing. But for example, in this table that is here already configured, I want to show you that we have some triggers that are going to be listening if we have some delete insert of update operation. So when we change the content of this table, of course, these triggers are going to say, hey, let's move the data or let's delete the data or whatever we did here. So I think you know that triggers are not like our best alternative when we need high performant scenarios. But again, this is an option that we can use for some specific use case that we need to work for moving the data, right? So if I go back here, just to show you that I want, for example, to again, I want to show here my replication. If I want new tables here, if I want to move different tables, just take a look at here where it says that we need all our tables work with primary keys. So that's another thing that we need to consider because the tables that don't have primary keys are going to be like this. grayed out. So we can't move those tables, we can't sync those tables, so we need to choose only the tables that have those primary keys. So I think that maybe it seems like a complex scenario, but I want to, to remember here the replication scenarios. If you have deployed a replication scenario, I'm pretty sure that you have seen the same considerations if we want to work with different places in order to replicate the data. So that's the most important thing when we want to deploy these scenarios, to understand what are the capabilities and what are, of course, the scope of this alternative, so we can take advantage of this, or maybe take a look at some other alternative. Okay, I'm going to show you here some documentation in order to see this. This is the SQL data sync we have configured. And if we go here, when to use, for example, here it says hybrid data synchronization, distributed applications, of course, when we have different regions or different databases. But take a look at here. Data sync isn't the preferred solution for these scenarios: disaster recovery, read scale, ETL, or migration. And here you have also another um, information. For example, advantages for data sync, active support. That's a good point. I think that's great. This bidirectional between on-premises and Azure SQL Database is also another good point for this feature. But of course, we need to take a look at here. We are not going to have transactional consistency, and it's going to have a higher performance impact because of those things I have here showed you, especially about this, right? Especially for this. All the tables that are going to be configured with data sync are going to work with triggers. So maybe it's not the best scenario if we want to talk about performance, right? Okay, I've seen a microphone. I don't know if someone has a question, maybe? Okay, okay, perfect. Well, talking about, for example, backups, if we need to work with backups from on-premises to Azure, I'm sure that you have seen that if we select here the alternative for backup, we have from, I think since 2014, if I'm not mistaken, we have here the alternative to work with URL. So we can send the backup to our Azure storage, so we can take advantage of this as well. For example, if we work with Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance, I was telling you before that okay, I'm sorry. So I was telling you before, one of the most biggest advantages of platform as a service are that we can delegate the administrative task to Azure, right? The backups, the monitoring, and different scenarios, right? If we want from on-premises to work with those characteristics, I mean, with virtual machines, I want to show you that with virtual machines now we have also another alternative that I can show you here. If I go through my virtual machine of SQL Server, for example, I want to show you here that we have this button here, SQL Server Configuration. If you have deployed a virtual machine on Azure and you have used images, you have the SQL Server, of course, if you, I want to show you here this, okay? If you go through the creation of a virtual machine, you have two possibilities, right? If I go to virtual machine, you have, I want to highlight this. you have the possibility to work with Azure Virtual Machine or Azure SQL Virtual Machine. Some people work with virtual machine if they want to personalize that virtual machine, install SQL Server, for example. Um, but if you go through the option of SQL Virtual Machine, you are going to have the image of SQL. You are going to choose which version of SQL do you want to deploy, which edition of SQL do you want to deploy, but you have already the SQL Server installed if you choose this second scenario. So in this second scenario, for example, this virtual machine, you are going to see here the SQL Server configuration. So this is not going to be on the first alternative. So take a look at here, and I'm going to show you how do you um, get this button here. So if I go to SQL Server configuration, I'm going to be able to see more information about this virtual machine. For example, here I go to manage the virtual machine, and from the beginning, you are going to see, for example, a monitoring option for what do I have on data, what do I have on log. Here you can see that I can manage the licensing, I can manage the storage, I can manage, for example, more security, the automatic patching, and the automated backups. So that's what I was referencing when I want to highlight that also on virtual machine, you can take advantage of some platform as a service benefits if you deploy the SQL Server from images, as I showed you here. So let's take a look at here. For example, if I go to backups, I can start enabling this alternative so I can select an storage, almost the same scenario as going through the Management Studio and selecting the URL. Here you can say, I have already an storage created. I want to enable the encryption for my database. I'm going to give here a password, right? Of course, it needs to be a, a good password, right? But I want to highlight here, let's disable this. I want to highlight here that I can select the alternative to backup my system databases, and I can configure my backup strategy here. So let's take a look at here. I can work with weekly or daily frequency. I can select the time I want those backups. I can select the option of log backup schedule, and I don't need to worry about deploying this strategy from maintenance task on Management Studio, for example, right? So I can work with my portal. I can enable this so I can get all the backups. Those backups are going to be stored on an Azure storage, and I can also configure the retention I need for those backups. But let's take a look that I don't need to deploy that administrative task from the SQL Server, right? The same here for high availability, for example. This feature is now on preview, but you are going to see this is amazing because I have a button to add a new Windows Server failover cluster, and I have a button to add a new always-on availability group. So this is moving to a scenario where we can deploy this kind of high availability options easier, right? Because if we think about the deployment of a manual deployment of always on, we need mm, from the beginning, we need a Windows Server failover cluster. We need the backups from the database. We need to move the backups. We need to restore the backups. We need to open some ports. We need to have the networking. But now, here, if you work with Azure SQL virtual machines, you are going to have the possibility to work with two buttons and deploy your high availability scenario. So that's why I was telling you that some options coming from platform as a service, now you can take advantage of those with virtual machines on Azure as well. So when I was here showing you the SQL Server, the SQL Server configuration button on my SQL Server virtual machine here, my SQL Server configuration button, the one that's here. If you don't have this button on your SQL virtual machine, you need to go through this. This is called the SQL Server IaaS agent extension here. And I have it here where you are going to see that you just need to understand how to enable this agent extension, and you are going to be able to manage your virtual machines closer to platform as a service with those benefits about managing the backups, the updates, etc. So you have the possibility to work with this agent extension. You are going to have more management from the portal, the automated backups, you are going to have the automated patching, etc. You can go through this documentation, and we have different options to install this agent. You can work with an automatic registration. For example, here, I'm going to show you that in the portal, you are going to have this, for example, here, you go to your SQL virtual machines, you go to this button that it's going to register all the virtual machines you have, and it's going to understand where is SQL Server installed, and then you are going to have the alternative of manage like this with this SQL Server configuration option from your virtual machine. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the links for this information. And I want to go here as well. AlwaysOn has been working in every version of SQL Server, in every new version of SQL Server. AlwaysOn is going to new capabilities, to new improvements, and I believe that since 2012, AlwaysOn has been the best alternative for high availability. So this same engine now it's going to be able to work with Azure Managed Instance, with Azure SQL Managed Instance, with the link for Managed Instance. So let's take a look at here. If I have this, for example, this database, and I want this database to be inside a high availability scenario with Azure, now we have the alternative to do this. Right click on the database. Let's see here that we have Azure SQL Managed Instance link and replicate our database, and maybe we can go also with failover, right? So let me go through this. I'm going again, right click, Azure SQL Managed Instance link, replicate database, and I have the wizard. I go next, and let's take a look at the requirements. Of course, I need the AlwaysOn enabled. I need to be sysadmin, and I need some trace flags to be able to deploy this. That's everything I need. You can see that if I go through my configuration manager, for example, this instance has these startup parameters. We have these two trace flags enabled. So that's the only thing I need. Of course, AlwaysOn is enabled here. And I just need to go through this validation. Here I need a master key in my instance, and then I go next, and I choose my database. Of course, what are the requirements here? My database that I want to move to manage instance as an availability group. Of course, I need a full backup previously. This first database has already the full backup. You can see here that the second needs a full backup. So I'm going to choose my first database. I'm going next. I'm going to sign in to my Azure subscription. Here I can choose, for example, my resource group, my managed instance. Where is my managed instance? And I go next. let's see here some additional configuration, because you are going to see that I need some open ports. I need a certificate just to connect my on-premises instance to managed instance. I'm going to have the availability group names, etc. And I go next. Just take a look that I almost didn't have any effort here. I just go next, go next. I have already created a certificate. That's all. I have opened some ports. I can show you here that on my firewall, you can see that I have these ports, for example, that are already opened. And that's all. That's all. I can go here. I go next. It's going to verify my choices. I go finish. And this is deploying my connection in an availability group from on-premises to managed instance. So I want to highlight that everything is going faster, everything is going easier, so you can configure these alternatives as well in order to remain your hybrid environments. So I'm sorry, I missed a question before for the data sync. Do we have latency in data sync from on-premises to Azure? In any scenario that we are moving anything from on-premises to Azure, we need to understand that our most important actor is the bandwidth, right? So in order to improve our connection, in order to reduce our latency, we can work with VPNs, we can work with Express Route in Azure to improve the bandwidth, right? And if we have a dedicated connection, because it's going to be, especially for something like, for example, my disaster recovery scenario, it's going to be better. So the latency depends especially on how are we deploying our connection from on-prem to Azure. I know you can have your gateways, you can have your VPNs, you can improve it with Express Route, but the latency it's going to be really dependent on the connection. For any scenario, for data sync, for this managed instance link, for moving the data across, for example, data factory, everything depends on your connections, right? So as you can see here, we have already deployed our AlwaysOn availability group. We have our database that is here on premises. It is on my instance here, and it's going to be replicated to our managed instance. So that's great for the new alternatives. Be aware that this is in public preview. This alternative, we are hoping that it's going to GA very soon. I believe that maybe when SQL 2022 goes GA, of course, the feature it's going to be GA as well. So I think here I can move here now. So let me talk to the other scenarios for moving the data or replicating the data from on-premises. The scenarios about analytics, the scenarios, for example, for building our modern data warehouse. When we need to move our data from on-premises to any destination, right? Maybe here we can see that, of course, through Data Factory, we can go to our data lake. We are going to deploy anything else. We are going to deploy Databricks or Synapse or machine learning, etc. But what's our most important steps here is the ingestion from SQL. Of course, here we are going to think, what can we do if we have SQL Server as a source, right? We can move with Data Factory. Of course, here you can use Synapse pipelines as well. But what are almost always our requirements? In a SQL data warehouse, sorry, in a data warehouse in general, we have two possibilities to load the data, right? The batch scenarios where we can schedule the loads, for example, at night, once a day, right? And we have also the scenario where we need almost real-time ingestion, right? So in this case, for example, we are seeing here the possibility to work with data factory pipelines or Synapse pipelines in order to move the data for example, in this case, for a batch scenario, right? But most of the cases now need more velocity, needs more real time, and we can work, of course, with resources like Event Hub, like IoT Hub. We can do some push actions in order to move the data uh, closer to real time. In some scenarios, for example, some customers have Kafka scenarios or maybe some Kubernetes doing that pushing of the data in order to those data comes to the data lake. But we have some alternatives as well in order to deploy these connections. For example, incremental copy for SQL Server, right? If we have our SQL Server on premise, you can develop a pipeline and you can understand what has changed in the source in order to move it to the destination. And this alternative works especially well. It goes, for example, through a lookup operation to understand what has changed on premises. You can build a query that works with change data capture in SQL, right? So the pipeline is going to know what's the new data, and with this understanding of change data capture, the pipeline can go through a if condition, right? If something has changed, let's move it. If nothing has changed, don't do anything, right? So this is a great alternative to understand what has changed on our database, right? You can work with these kind of pipelines. For example, a lot of a lot you can schedule this, for example, every hour, every half hour, every 15 minutes. I don't know. You need to understand, of course, what's the behavior of your database, but you can work with these kind of pipelines also in order to schedule and have the movement to your new analytics scenario. And in some cases that you need, I was mentioning before, more real-time movement of the data. You can work with different providers. You can work with those kind of Kafka scenarios, but also you have a possibility I have seen in a lot of clients working with this, with Click integration. I don't know if you have, maybe you have seen Click for um, visualization, right? But Click has also some integration tools where you can work connecting to your relational database management system and move it to something that could be, for example, your data warehouse. You can work with Click integration to continuously move the data that comes from SQL Server on-premise to an Azure data lake, for example. And this is going to orchestrate all the movement, right? You just need to configure the Click integration. You say, this is my SQL Server. You say, this is my data lake. And the Click integrator is going to take all the tasks in order to move that information all the time, all the day, all day long, right? So this is great because you are going to see an interesting GUI where you can see your data. You can see, as you can see here, you can see the what's inside the tables. You can see the structure of the tables, but also you are going to be able to see, for example, which data has been completely moved to the destination. You can see some estimation counts. If you have a lot of rows, you have new rows. This integrator is going to be the main actor to control those movement from on-premises to Azure. So this is another good alternative as well. And now we have also in preview the option, for example, for working with a linked service from Synapse connecting to a SQL Server. So these are new alternatives also to move your SQL Server um, sources from on-premise to Azure, in this case, working with especially with Synapse, right? So a lot of scenarios. I want you to see that we have different scenarios for SQL Server. We have different options for high availability disaster recovery. Replicating data maybe is different from HA and DR, but in some cases we need to move some data. In some cases we need to deploy, for example, testing databases, QA databases. So those are not meant to be replicated all the time. They don't need synchronization. They don't need real time, right? But we have the need to move the data. So replicating, for example, with data sync, maybe it's a good alternative. You have seen here that also we have different alternatives for building our modern data warehouse. And I believe that new options coming from Azure are going to be shown very soon. So if you have any question regarding to these topics, please feel free to contact me. Here is my LinkedIn account, the same for Twitter. If you want to connect, if you want to chat further, of course, I'm very happy to help. I'm very happy to connect. Um, Here I have a question. It says, what are the high availability and disaster recovery option for Azure SQL Database? That's a great question because, for example, just give me 1 second because I want to show you something here. Uh, for Azure SQL Database, if I go back to my portal, I showed before here. I'm going to move through my SQL database. If you have deployed this, for example, I have this in the model of TTUs. This is a standard. You can go here, for example, in SQL database, you can go to general purpose, you can go to business critical. And if you have general purpose, you have already some by default high availability. In any case, you have a primary database with an error, if your primary server goes down, you have an alternative to recover because that's built in, that's by default. If you have business critical in Azure SQL Database, you are going to have under the hood the same scenario as an AlwaysOn with different replicas. And also you have the possibility to work with a read-only replica if you go with business critical. So those resources have by default a high availability capabilities, but you can expand those, for example, with the geo-replication that I was talking before. Here you have the alternative to go with replicas, and you can create a new replica to have, for example, a disaster recovery scenario. So this is, for example, in East US, you can go to a geo replica, a new geo replica, and you can choose a different region. So you deploy your disaster recovery scenario, right? So this is going to help to increase your nines in your service, right? So that those are the alternatives for Azure SQL Database. There's another question. It says, which editions will support bidirectional high availability? This bidirectional for SQL data sync, let me go through this. I think I had heard it before. Never mind, I'm going to paste it again. Okay. For SQL data sync, you need to understand that this is the scenario for this active support and this bidirectional between on-premises and Azure SQL, right? So I believe it is here on general requirement. Just let me one moment. If it's not here, I'm going to go back with you to confirm which are the supported edition and versions. But if we were talking about, for example, the managed instance link, here you have the requirements for versions and editions, okay? So I'm going to share with you all the URLs here. Let me paste here. This is for the link feature, and I'm going to confirm with you for Azure SQL Data Sync, but here is the documentation as well, okay? So that's great. Well, I think that we are just on time. Again, please, if you have another question, please feel free to contact me later. I will be very happy to get in contact with you. And thanks for your participation here. Thank you for being here. I hope we can meet very soon again. So thank you very much. That's all, and I'm going to end the recording. Okay, that's great, and let's see you later. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you very much. Goodbye.